It is 20 minutes past midnight on June 6, 1944, and somewhere above the Normandy coast a Stirling bomber shudders through cloud at 400 feet, far lower than any sane pilot would choose to fly in daylight, let alone in darkness with the enemy listening below. Inside the fuselage, 10 men sit in silence, their faces blackened, their kit strapped tight against the jump. None of them carries a rifle in his hands. What each man carries instead is a leather satchel containing a Eureka radar beacon, a bundle of Holophane lamps, and a set of colored filters. In a few minutes, if everything goes to plan, these men will become the first Allied soldiers to touch French soil on the day that decides the war in the West. They are not the invasion. They are the men sent to mark the invasion's arrival. Behind them, though none of them can see it yet, 6,000 aircraft are forming up over England, carrying the largest airborne assault force ever launched. If this handful of pathfinders misses its mark by even a few hundred meters, entire battalions could scatter into flooded marshland, into German gun positions, into the wrong war altogether. The red light above the door flicks to green. One by one, they go. What follows in the next 40 minutes will determine whether Britain's 6th Airborne Division lands as a fighting force or as a scattering of lost men wandering the Norman countryside in the dark. This is the story of the pathfinders, the soldiers who jumped first so that everyone else could jump straight. By the spring of 1944, Allied planners faced a problem that no amount of naval gunfire or strategic bombing could solve on its own. The invasion of Normandy depended on seizing the flanks of the beachhead within the first hours of daylight, before German armor could counterattack and push the landing force back into the sea. On the eastern flank, that task fell to Britain's 6th Airborne Division, which would drop by parachute and glider in the darkness before dawn to capture bridges over the Caen Canal and the River Orne, destroy a coastal gun battery at Merville capable of raining fire onto the beaches, and secure the high ground against German reinforcements. It was an audacious plan, and it depended entirely on one thing that airborne warfare had never yet managed to achieve with any reliability: accuracy. Earlier airborne operations, most notably the Allied drop into Sicily in July 1943, had ended in chaos. High winds, inexperienced pilots, and poor navigation had scattered paratroopers across dozens of kilometers of Sicilian countryside, with some units landing so far from their objectives that they took no meaningful part in the battle at all. In Normandy, the stakes were higher still. The drop zones lay in a landscape of small, high-hedged fields, the notorious bocage, crisscrossed with drainage ditches and deliberately flooded by the Germans in low-lying areas near the Dives estuary. A stick of paratroopers who missed their zone by half a kilometer might land in chest-deep water, weighed down by equipment, and drown before they ever fired a shot. Navigators flying at night under blackout conditions with no radio contact permitted for fear of alerting the enemy had almost no reliable way of finding a precise field in the dark at low level while under fire. The RAF's own studies after Sicily concluded that visual map reading alone, at night, over unfamiliar and hostile terrain, simply could not deliver the accuracy the operation demanded. Something had to go in ahead of the main force, something small enough to slip in undetected and precise enough to guide hundreds of aircraft to fields the width of a few football pitches. The answer was not a new aircraft or a new weapon. It was a new kind of soldier. That soldier came from the 22nd Independent Parachute Company, a unit raised specifically to solve this problem and trained at Ringway, near Manchester, under the command of Major Francis Boy Lawrence Wilson. Officially designated as the Pathfinder Force for 6th Airborne Division, the company numbered fewer than 200 men, hand-picked for physical toughness, navigational skill, and the nerve required to jump first, alone, ahead of everyone else into ground that had not yet been secured by anybody. Their equipment was, by the standards of 1944, remarkably compact for the job it had to do. The Eureka beacon, developed by the Telecommunications Research Establishment, was a portable radar transponder weighing around 15 kilograms, roughly the weight of a large suitcase, that could be assembled and switched on within minutes of landing. Once active, it emitted a coded radio pulse that could be picked up by a corresponding receiver called Eureka, fitted to the transport aircraft following behind. A navigator watching the Eureka screen could read both the direction and the distance to the Eureka set, effectively turning an invisible field in blacked out Normandy into a fixed point on a radar display, accurate to within a few hundred meters at several kilometers range. It was, in effect, a homing beacon for an entire division, and it worked regardless of ground haze, smoke, or the poor visibility that had doomed the Sicily drop. Alongside the Eureka sets, the pathfinders carried Holophane lamps, battery-powered lights fitted with colored lenses, which they would plant in prearranged patterns, usually in the shape of a letter, to give the aircrew a visual confirmation once they were close enough to see the ground. Each drop zone was assigned its own lamp color and Eureka frequency, so that following aircraft could distinguish one landing zone from another, even as multiple drops converged on the same stretch of coastline within the same half hour. Training for the role took place over several months on airfields in the English Midlands, where the pathfinders practiced assembling their equipment against the clock, in full darkness, timing themselves to have both the beacon and the lamp pattern operational within 8 minutes of landing. 8 minutes was the margin between success and a division scattered across Normandy in the dark. On the night itself, the pathfinders of 22nd Independent Parachute Company took off from RAF airfields in southern England shortly before midnight, flying in a small formation of 6 Stirling bombers ahead of the main airborne force. They jumped in 3 groups, each tasked with marking one of the division's 3 drop zones east of the River Orne. The drop did not go entirely to plan. Parts of the force were scattered by flak, and by the same difficulties of night navigation the operation was designed to overcome, and at least one stick came down some distance from its intended field. But enough of the pathfinders landed close enough and worked fast enough that by the time the main force of paratroopers began arriving around midnight, functioning Eureka beacons and lamp patterns were active on the ground to guide them in. Soldiers of the 5th Parachute Brigade and 3rd Parachute Brigade, dropping into fields they had only ever seen on aerial photographs and sand table models, found their way to rally points because a handful of men had gone in first, alone, in the dark, to switch on a light. Later, that same night, pathfinders also supported the glider landings near the Caen Canal bridges, the operation that would become famous as the capture of Pegasus Bridge, helping guide the Horsa gliders of the coup de main party to their tiny, hedge-ringed landing fields with a precision that still impresses military historians studying the operation today. Records of the pathfinders' individual actions that night remain frustratingly sparse. Many of the men involved gave only brief accounts after the war, and official histories focus more on the units they guided in than on the guides themselves. If you are enjoying this look into one of the least remembered units of D-Day, a quick subscribe genuinely helps this channel keep telling these stories. Germany had experimented with its own Pathfinder concepts years earlier, developing radio beam navigation systems for the Luftwaffe's bomber Pathfinder units, the Kampfgruppe 100, which used systems such as Nicobene and the X-Jurat to guide bombing raids onto British cities during the Blitz. But these were technologies for guiding aircraft to a target, not for guiding paratroopers to a field and then confirming the drop visually on the ground, and Germany never developed an equivalent airborne Pathfinder infantry unit of its own, in part because by 1944, German airborne operations had effectively ceased following the costly invasion of Crete 3 years earlier. The Americans, dropping onto the western flank of the Normandy beachhead the same night, fielded their own Pathfinder teams from the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, using the same basic Eureka technology supplied under Lend-Lease arrangements from British research. American Pathfinders, however, suffered even more badly from the disorientation and scattering that plagued the night drop generally. Several of their teams landed well off target, and some American paratroop units that night ended up as much as 25 kilometers from their intended drop zones, a scale of error the British Pathfinder-guided drops on the eastern flank largely avoided. The difference came down partly to terrain and partly to the smaller, more tightly controlled British drop zones, but contemporary after-action reports from both air forces credited the Pathfinder concept itself, when it worked, with dramatically improving drop accuracy over the disastrous precedent set in Sicily the previous year. It was a British-developed solution to a problem every Allied airborne force shared, and by the autumn of 1944, Pathfinder companies using Eureka-Rebecca techniques were standard practice for major airborne operations, including the ill-fated drop at Arnhem in September. The material impact of the Pathfinders on the night of 5th and 6th June is difficult to measure with precision, and honest historians are careful not to overstate it. Some units still landed off target, some Eureka sets were lost or damaged in the drop, and the fog of a night airborne assault meant no single factor can be credited with the division's eventual success in securing its objectives. What can be said with confidence is that the Pathfinder concept represented a fundamental shift in how airborne forces approached the problem of night navigation, moving from a reliance on individual pilot skill and visual map reading toward a system of ground-based, technology-assisted guidance that treated accuracy as something that could be engineered, rather than simply hoped for. The psychological value to the paratroopers who followed should not be underestimated either. Men jumping into darkness over enemy territory, uncertain of exactly where they would land, found genuine reassurance in seeing a lamp pattern or hearing a beacon confirmed on the aircraft's approach, a small proof that someone had already been there and marked the way. The techniques pioneered by 22nd Independent Parachute Company that night influenced airborne doctrine for the rest of the war and beyond. Pathfinder units remain a standard feature of airborne forces to this day, including in the British and American militaries, a direct institutional descendant of the men who jumped first into Normandy. A memorial to the company stands today near Ranville, close to the fields where the earliest Pathfinders landed, and the Airborne Assault Museum at Duxford preserves examples of the Eureka beacon equipment the men carried, silent reminders of a technology that once meant the difference between a division landing together and a division landing lost. 20 past midnight, and somewhere above the Normandy coast a handful of men step out into darkness that no Allied soldier has yet touched. They carry no rifles worth speaking of, no orders to hold ground, no glory waiting for them in the official histories that will be written about this day. What they carry is a radio set the size of a suitcase and a handful of colored lamps, and on those unglamorous tools rests the accuracy of an entire division's arrival into battle. They land in fields they have only rehearsed on models, under skies thick with flak with no guarantee that the enemy has not seen them come down. And then, working against a clock that allows no margin for hesitation, they assemble their equipment, switch on their beacons, and wait for the sound of engines that will tell them whether the rest of the division found its way. Some of them are scattered by wind and flak just as badly as the men who would follow, but enough of them, on enough drop zones, get it right, and because they get it right, thousands of paratroopers descending into darkness an hour later find fields instead of flooded marshes, rally points instead of confusion, a fighting division instead of a scattered one. History remembers Pegasus Bridge. History remembers the Merville Battery. History rarely remembers the men who switched on the lights that made those actions possible. They were never meant to fight the battle themselves. They were meant only to make sure everyone else could find it. In the story of D-Day, so often told through the roar of naval guns and the mass of ships crossing the Channel at dawn, it is worth pausing on this quieter, stranger fact, that before the Armada, before the beaches, before the bridges, the invasion of Europe began with a handful of men standing alone in a dark field, switching on a lamp and trusting that somewhere above them, in the roaring dark, someone would see it.